Hello and welcome to my first ever plus size kite board review, where I try my hand at riding and comparing some of the most popular boards on the market right now. In this video I will be riding and filming the North Atmos Carbon Pro, the Duotone Jaime SLS, the Carved Imperator 7, the Ozone Torque, the Lue Falcon, the Crazyfly Elite, the Core Fusion 5, and of course my rather beat up 2023 Atmos Carbon for a comparison versus the newer model. And because frankly it's going to be a long video, so I'll probably need the added footage from my kite reviews to get through it all without too much repetition. I will be talking about my impressions in regards to each board's feel in both lighter and stronger conditions, how they handle different water surfaces, the comfort and ease of use of the foot pads and their straps, their weights and how they affect the experience riding them, and most importantly, how confident they made me feel on the water. All the boards are sized between 137 and 140, but each board rides quite differently, so for some I didn't feel like I quite had the ideal size for my style and their design. So I will try to explain as well where I think a rider might want to size up or size down depending how they like to ride. Because this is my first ever board review, the filming a lot of the time is a bit rubbish in that I clearly forgot to look at the board before and after jumps, so you'll just have to use your imagination a little bit. No doubt I will also miss out on plenty of key details and get some things wrong. So please drop any follow-up questions or thoughts you have below in the comments, and I will get to them with what are hopefully adequate answers. I will be basing most of this review primarily on my own feel and the experiences I had while testing all these boards, with some input from my local friends who are at my level. This means it might not all be completely accurate, of course, outside of this review. I have mainly been riding the same board for 4 years now over 3 different editions of it. So I did find it quite challenging adjusting to some of these boards that were quite different in shape or that required a different riding style to use them confidently. As always, if you enjoy the review, please like, comment, and subscribe if you are new to the channel. And perhaps share this video in any of your local kite groups if you think it might help people with their shopping purchases. You can also follow me on Instagram for more up-to-date information about what I am testing next. Please also, as always, check out Mac Kiteboarding, who provided some of this demo gear and have a far more extensive selection of gear reviews on their own YouTube channel. I will add a link in the description to the various boards you can purchase directly from them. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to the reviews. So I'm going to start off with the North Atmos because frankly I am the most familiar with it, and like the North Orbit, I feel like it is that ideal board that might not specifically be the best at any one category, but just works great overall for a bit of everything, particularly of course for big air. Although I'm going to try to be, I am regrettably rather biased of course, because I have been on these boards for 3 to 4 years now, and in that time, whenever I have briefly tested something else, I didn't enjoy the experience enough to want to swap. For the sake of doing this review well, I really had to have a lot of sessions over the last few months where I just left the Atmos at home, so I was forced to get some more time and practice on the other boards. I found that particularly when the wind was stronger, my inner bitch just wanted to go back out on what I was most comfortable on. And it was challenging and nerve-wracking at times trying other boards in the more challenging conditions with stronger winds. I have learned over this review that your familiarity and comfort with your board is so essential for being able to ride hard, well, and with confidence, perhaps even more so than your kite. It certainly made me reconsider how impactful our boards are to our riding, and how having a good quality board that you feel dialed in on to the conditions you prefer can really be an absolute game changer to both your day-to-day sessions and your overall progression. Now, first off, looking at the differences from the 23 to the 24 Atmos, I can't say there is much I could really notice. The main thing being that the 24 is actually a new board, of course, so it is noticeably faster and more direct when engaging your edge. More so, of course, than my rather beat up 23 board with its deep scratches and bass that has hit more rocks than Whitney Houston. The 2024 did also feel a little bit stiffer and very marginally heavier than the 23. So it might be a bit more durable, certainly more durable than mine, and both are among the stiffest boards I was testing. So if you don't really like a stiff board, but like the rest of what I have to say about the Atmos Pro or Atmos Carbon, I would suggest trying the Atmos Hybrid. Although the Hybrid is a little bit heavier, the higher ratio of wood in the core really softens it nicely for those of you with knees that have seen better days, and I imagine would also be friendlier if you happen to be lighter or are a progressing rider. With both Atmos, compared to some of the other boards, I have found that for its size, they tend to ride a little bit shorter than the 138 size would suggest, particularly when compared to, say, the Jaime SLS, which I was testing in a 139 size, but it felt like it was 2 to 3 sizes larger than my 138 Atmos. I have wondered about riding smaller boards for really extreme big air for some time now, but having tried these other boards, I realize, at least with my Atmos, the 138 really is my sweet spot. This board doesn't have any significantly pronounced rails on its base, which I would have thought would make it harder to grip in most conditions, but after riding the others, I don't find it to be an issue, and I actually feel more stable on it, which I believe is due to the overall design, from the shape of its base to its outline curve and other features in the design, rather than just its lack of pronounced rails or channels on the base. Of course, my familiarity and having adapted my riding style over time to using the Atmos is certainly a big factor. After trying all these boards, when powered in particular, I've noticed that the Atmos seems to reward a more balanced riding stance between my legs. That is a little less heel side edge heavy than you would want to ride some of these other boards that have very pronounced tail grip and a different shape through the middle of the board, particularly the thicker ones. I also like that I can easily rotate my stance from heel to toe side on the water smoothly without any edges catching, something I found could be tricky without adding a little hop on some of the other boards. I like this particularly when I'm coming in hot from jumps. I have a little bit more leeway, whereas I could understand other people wanting to be more locked in. I just never seem to catch a bad edge though with this board, even in very choppy conditions, or when landing from coming in from big loops and things like that. I always feel quite controlled. On the comparative downside, this board feels slightly heavier than most of the other ones, perhaps the second heaviest I tested after the Ozone board, and it fits somewhere in the middle of the pack in terms of its natural acceleration and overall speed across the water. At my level and with my experience I've had over this testing, I realized that having the additional potential speed can be rather useless if you can't control it. I would also wager, because this board rides like a smaller size, at least to me, that it would also be why it feels a little slower in general. If I had more time on some of the boards, I could see this being more of a negative. As with anything, riding with more speed is never a bad thing once you are used to it and can handle it. In particular, when you're trying to boost in challenging conditions, or where you have less space, say between chop, being able to accelerate quickly is ideal for building up to that 35 to 45 kilometers per hour region you want to be sending your big jumps from. I am riding these boards with 40 millimeter fins as well, which seem to also be the sweet spot for me. However, on some of the other boards that had a slicker base with less heel side edge control, I found the larger fins did help with the overall control of the board, so it made sense that they were not all the same from board to board. The bindings are also ones I'm very familiar with, and I would say probably have the firmest footbed of the various ones ridden, but being used to it, I think I prefer it now. They also seem to fit my foot shape the best of all the ones I tried, which is a wide, flatter foot with very little inside arc. I do have other friends with longer, narrower feet who have been testing these boards with me as well, however, and outside of their usual bindings that they're used to, there is a little bit of a consensus that these seem to be the overall most comfortable, aside from the duotone ones, which were probably the favorites. I'm sure if you were testing these for the first time, they might feel a bit strange being so firm, as I do recall when I first put on the current versions of the straps that I found myself being kind of firm, but within a session or two I was used to it and now prefer it. Another point of difference to the rest of the bindings I rode was that these have a little bit more of an elevated edge around the foot to help lock your feet in. You'd think they got in the way more than they seem to with board offs, but I still tend to find these the easiest of those tested for board offs because of my feet's ability to easily slide in and out and lock in thanks to that edge. Even if you are riding the straps a bit looser, which is quite handy. This is also another feature that I would imagine riders coming from other boards would be annoyed by at first, just the shape being so different, but again, I'm used to it and prefer it. Because of the firm base and slightly different shape, I don't think these are the most naturally comfortable bindings for everyone, but they're certainly right up there if you give them a little bit more time, especially if you have flatter, wider feet like I do. Another great feature that this board has over the last two models that I think should really be the norm on the market nowadays is that you can reverse your bindings to ride a fresh heel side edge after a lot of use on your original side. I just love this feature and don't know why other brands don't do it as well. This one seems like a no-brainer, really. So overall, despite not being as naturally quick through the water as some of the top boards, with its relative control and ability to perform in strong winds and varying water conditions, this board is just an absolute banger, and it's certainly one I would urge anyone to try. Now, getting on to the other boards, let's have a look next at the Ozone Torque, another sized 138 board I tested. Right off the bat, picking it up, the board feels a little heavier than the others, but when back-to-back with the Atmos, not hugely noticeable. Perhaps the same as the hybrid. The board I was riding was borrowed from a friend of mine who has been on it as well for over a year, so it is not as fresh as some of these other boards I am testing that were fairly newer demos from Mac or other friends. So I have to cut it a little bit of slack in some areas. When I hopped on it immediately, I found it fairly easy to control. It was probably the slowest, however, through the water of the boards I tested. Some of this would be because of its wear and tear, of course, but I'd have to imagine the base has something to do with it as well. The board has a quad concave base, which I found did a great job of really locking you in, even in choppy water, with stronger winds on the day I tested it. I was able to maneuver it around fairly easily, but not quite as much as my Atmos. When I was coming in hot from loops or bigger jumps, I never felt the board slide out or lose my balance, which is certainly awesome for a first time riding it. I've never ridden any of the other Ozone boards either, and something I certainly can't say for most of the boards I was testing. I would imagine on a newer board this base would be a little bit slicker and faster than the one I was riding, but unlikely enough to catch up with the other boards just simply based on its design and how much control it gives you. The fins were also a larger size, I believe 50 millimeters, which I found a little bit annoying, especially when the base already had its own natural grip, but it made sense for my friend who I borrowed it from, who's about 2 to 3 inches taller than me and rides with a larger stance. So I'd imagine this makes it a bit better for him. The lack of acceleration when I was really ready to put the pedal to the metal for jumps was a bit annoying, and I felt I need just a little bit more space than for some of these faster boards to really build up to what I would consider an ideal boosting speed. In terms of the bindings, not a bad feeling underfoot, but the straps themselves were very firm on the top and the sides of my feet and fit quite narrowly. So I had some trouble actually squeezing into them, despite them being set for my mate, who is a much larger human. This made board-offs far too challenging prospect for me, so I can't comment unfortunately on how easy it would have been for somebody with a more traditional foot shape to get in and out of them. So for the bindings, although not completely unrideable by any means, these were one of my least preferred of the bindings and straps that I was testing. Overall though, another great board that was really easy to jump on and ride, even despite having a different shape for the bindings to what I'm used to, or for the board's base to what I'm used to. I probably wouldn't recommend it for lighter winds or perhaps even smaller riders, simply because it's a bit on the heavier side versus the others, but it's definitely a great option for big air, riding in challenging conditions, or of course being a huskier gentleman like myself. The next board up is the Crazyfly Elite, which, unless I'm mistaken, is the lightest board on the market. And although this was the largest board I was testing at 140, it definitely felt like one of the lightest, if not actually the lightest, despite its larger size. This board was certainly the biggest challenge for me to ride in the stronger conditions because of how light and slippery I found it, so I don't have as much footage on it. I still went out in 25 to 30 knots, and I did throw some medium-sized loops and carved around on it, just to be sure of course, but I just didn't feel like I was in good control while riding it when the wind was pumping, and it really struggled for me in the choppy waters. The heel side edge of this board is a bit thicker and more rounded than the other boards, and although the base has a double concave bottom shape, it didn't seem to give me the same kind of grip from similar channels of, say, the Ozone board. It made up a bit of ground with also having larger 15mm fins, but again, I personally find the larger fin size kind of annoying due to not only my lack of familiarity with them, but how often I seem to catch them on the odd bits of chop or current, particularly when turning or maneuvering the board. Certainly a large part of the challenge for me with this larger board was that it rode like it was a bit larger than the other sizes, so it also does make sense that I struggled particularly in the stronger sessions. But there wasn't a ton of edging or control underneath it either. When it was a lot lighter and I was on my 12-meter kite, however, I found the board much easier to use, and I think that's where I would recommend it for anyone, particularly in flat water. The bindings were also unfortunately my least favorite as well, because they are a bit firmer under the foot and they have a very pronounced interior area around the medium arc of the foot, which isn't great of course for my flatter feet. It also felt like I was, because of this, wearing orthopedic shoe inserts, which I didn't enjoy. Because the board was so ridiculously light for its size, I could see it being really great for board-off progression, particularly for people sort of my level and getting to my level. And I found doing board-offs with it, even in lighter wind where I wasn't getting as much height, quite easy to flick it off and back on. I found, however, I did struggle a little bit to squeeze my feet back into the straps because of that arc I mentioned. I certainly put my hand up that I didn't give this board nearly as much water time as any of the other boards, because I frankly just didn't trust myself on it for the reasons mentioned. It's just too light and slippery for me to feel stable on. I think I would really like this board if I was riding in a Brazil lagoon every day in 18 to 24 knots and working on some Toby Brower style moves, but for a bigger rider in big air conditions, it was my least favorite overall of the ones tested. Next up we have the Core Fusion 5, and you may ask why I am testing an older model of this board. Well, it is just because not long after the Fusion 5 came out, I bought one when I was all into the Core promotional hype. I did get a bit of a deal on it too, and I wanted something to match my XR7s that I was riding at the time. But unfortunately, after only about 3 or 4 sessions, I realized I just wasn't a fan of this board at all, and ended up giving it to my old man, only to get right back onto buying my current 2023 Atmos that I still ride. Luckily at the time, he was getting into winging, so this board has hardly been used, and I was able to get back on it to film it, and to just make sure if what I was remembering about the board was actually how I felt about it still. Unfortunately, I have since accidentally lost all the footage from that session, so you'll just have to trust me that I rode it again for about another hour or so in about 25 knots. Did some loops, did some woosts, all the usual, but unfortunately there is no footage to tell the tale. This time around I did find the board a little bit easier, but I still couldn't quite get the hang of it, and found I struggled with the combination of its shape, the significant amount of channels over the base, and just the combination of the rails, everything sort of about it was just a bit strange for me. There's something about its shape that both makes me struggle to control it, despite having so much grip on it, and also hold a strong edge with confidence. I do seem to also catch a lot of random edges in the chop and the currents when I'm landing from jumps with some speed. I actually do have, however, several friends who own or have owned this board and really love it. So my ego really wanted to be able to ride it well this time around, but it just wasn't the case, unfortunately. I also found this board perhaps the second slowest through the water after the Ozone board, and this one has an almost untouched base, so it is in very, very good condition. In terms of weight, it does feel a little bit lighter than the Atmos. It is a 137 size, so that would be a factor, but I don't think it's quite as light as the top few lightest boards that I would say were the Crazyfly Elite, the Lue Falcon, or the Carved Imperator. If you can keep your balance back a little bit more and dig in that heel well as you build up your speed, it can certainly do a great job for big air, but I never really got my timing or balance down to feel the confidence I would need to really send it hard. So I certainly don't regret moving on from it despite the dent it left in my wallet. Unfortunately for us in New Zealand, we don't really have core. You see them around occasionally, but there are no shops, so there's not really a resale market for any core gear, which is why it's hard to test them. In terms of the bindings, these were also a bit of a problem for me. Like the Ozone, the footbed was firm, but not in a bad way, although I think I would prefer a bit more grip. The straps as well, however, were quite firm, and it seemed better suited to narrower feet riders again. If I loosened them enough to be comfortable and fit inside, my feet would sneak under the edges of them and press against the plastic when I moved in certain ways, which was quite uncomfortable. They also had a habit of putting unwanted pressure on the tops of my feet, which I didn't really enjoy. So all in all, hard to be fair to this board because I just really struggled with it. But if you like a board with lots of channels, rails, and this sort of shape, then it's something that's certainly worth trying. But yeah, it wasn't for me. So from here on, there are still 3 more boards to go. But given we are already over the 20-minute mark, I am going to leave it as part 1 for this video. And I will continue on with part 2, where I will cover the Carved Imperator, the Lue Falcon, and the Jaime SLS. And I'd have to say one of these boards is probably my overall favorite. So be sure to check out part 2 coming very soon. Thanks. Goodbye.